Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. This is part 2 of my interview with Mr. Warren Redlich about the DUI issue. Mr. Redlich is an attorney and the author of Fair DUI, Stay Safe and Sane in a World Gone Mad, with MAD spelled M-A-D-D. He specializes in personal injury and criminal defense law and has handled numerous cases in traffic court. He has also run for the U.S. House of Representatives and for Governor of New York. You can follow his work at fairdui.org and westspokennews.com. You can find him on Facebook under Fair DUI and on Twitter at Fair DUI. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/DUI-2. I want to go to what happens once you get to the trial, and in particular, I want to focus on the judges and the prosecutors. Oftentimes, these are elected positions, and they like to brag about their being tough on crime, and prosecutors will brag about DUI convictions. How does that factor, that these are elected positions and that these are political figures who like to brag about these statistics, how does that factor in to the likelihood of someone being found wrongly guilty for this?
Sure. I don't generally see judges bragging about being tough on crime. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I don't generally see that. And generally, the prosecutor who's actually prosecuting the case is not the politician who got elected. It's somebody who works for that politician. So I don't think that's necessarily as big of a problem. But like my home county, Albany County, New York, the prosecutor took a position where there would be very little plea bargaining, and took the position that almost everybody has to plead guilty to what they're charged with, which I thought was very unreasonable. And the prosecutors who are working for him had to follow that. And, it would be very difficult to get one of them to, you show them, hey, I've got you beat. Here's why you're going to lose a trial. You should drop the case. And the orders come down from above. No, fight him anyway. Which I got to the point in Albany County, I moved from there 5 years ago, but I would never tell the prosecutor what was wrong with their case anymore because I couldn't trust them to use the information. They would use the information against me rather than use it to persuade the county prosecutor, their boss, to drop the case. It depended on which prosecutor. Some local prosecutors I could talk to, and some I knew they didn't have the pull to be able to force something. So, but I don't think that, there's a different way I would put it, which is, particularly with the judges, if you go to a courthouse, who's protecting the judge? The police. The police vote a lot more than regular people. So if a judge is seen as not sufficiently, it's not so much that the judge is out there saying, I'm tough on crime, I convict a lot of drunk drivers. It's that if a judge is not seen that way by Mothers Against Drunk Driving, by the police, if a judge finds a police officer is not credible, then the cops are mad at, even if the guy's not credible, then police take that as an offense, and they might vote that judge out or encourage people to vote that judge out. If Mothers Against Drunk Driving thinks a judge is not tough enough on drunk drivers, then they might push for someone else to run against them and support that guy, and they vote. I don't think I have not had that much experience with judges being difficult. And there's also, depending on where you are, I've seen a lot of judges who are former cops or former prosecutors. And they have an inherent, intrinsic bias. Some of them, you keep in mind, you can be a former prosecutor, former cop, and be the best guy on that kind of stuff. But there's sort of an intrinsic bias to believing that these DUI prosecutions are good and right because I was doing them myself. It's actually one of the problems, I think, in the defense bar is some of the defense lawyers are former prosecutors, and they think their job is to smooth things over rather than to fight. And I've seen that. And, I've seen plenty of innocent people advised by their lawyers to plead guilty. So that's very disturbing to me.
Wow. Well, I guess
I don't know if I answered your question at all there.
Yeah. Well, I guess the potential penalty of going to trial is often worse than what they'd be accepting in a plea deal.
Actually, what's surprising is a lot of times the penalty from going to trial and losing is not much different from the penalty from pleading guilty or taking a deal. And that's one of the big conversations I have with a lot of my clients. The problems are the cost of going to trial, the feeling of having the guillotine hanging over your head while you wait for your case to be resolved. Also, there's a very common thing. It's not as bad in Florida as it is in New York. It's particularly bad in New York. If you don't plead guilty, here's the way it works in New York. New York is the one I'm most familiar with. If you don't plead guilty in New York, you plead not guilty, then your license is suspended. If you plead guilty, then your license is you have a good license for 20 days, and then you go into a program, and you get suspended, but you get to continue driving. So the rule is in New York, if you plead not guilty, you can't drive, and if you plead guilty, you can. Right? So you're innocent until proven guilty. You with me so far?
Right. Yeah.
So the guilty people can drive, and the innocent people can't.
It turns everything that you're supposed to think about the system on its head.
Well, and this is the thing. It's a little bit true with the drug war as well. But I believe that the criminal law has been expanded. We have a lot of social problems, and there's a lot of people who think that the answer to our social problems is to use the criminal law. And the reality is that the criminal law is not great for solving social problems, and it is great for ruining people's lives. Find out how you feel. You can be innocent and arrested for DUI and find out what an impact that has on your life, and you'll realize, wait a minute, this is a big deal. To me, if you haven't hurt anyone, I don't believe there's a role for the criminal law. I just don't. Maybe there's some civil rules we should have, but you should not be prosecuting people for crimes if they haven't hurt anyone. Somebody smoking a joint, somebody sells somebody marijuana, somebody buys marijuana, somebody using heroin. If they haven't hurt someone else, it shouldn't be treated with the criminal law. That doesn't mean it's good for them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to get them into treatment or whatever. There's all kinds of things you could do. But using the criminal law to address these problems is just stupid. And it's harmful and it's horrible. And that's kind of what motivates me, because I've seen, it's funny, I don't think I thought about this much before I became a criminal defense lawyer. I thought about the drug war before. I became aware of that before. But having worked as a criminal defense lawyer, the extent to which criminal prosecution hurts people, the process of criminal prosecution is so difficult for people and so harmful to them, even if they are ultimately found not guilty, right? Even if they get found not guilty by a jury or they get the case dismissed after 6 months or a year or whatever, having to go through that is horrible. And, I think that's a very blunt tool and it should be used sparingly. And we live in a world where most people think you should be prosecuted for everything. I mean, frankly, just about everything we do is illegal now. There's so many laws. I read there's some estimate that the average person commits 3 federal felonies a day and doesn't know it. We made so many things illegal; it's just insane. But this is when the rubber hits the road for most people. This is where it really hits: is smoking marijuana or driving a car after having a glass of wine. We've turned it from a social problem into this massive criminal law enterprise. Call it the criminal justice system. It's the criminal injustice system.
Right, yeah. Harvey Silverglate has a book. I think it's called 3 Felonies a Day.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Right, where he talks about that exact thing. But I want to focus on a subject that you briefly mentioned, and that's Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So what is that group, and what do they promote?
Mothers Against Drunk Driving was founded by a woman named Candace Leitner many, many years ago. I think her child was killed in a drunk driving accident. She wanted to start a group that would cut down on drunk driving. She ultimately left the organization because she felt it had gone too far, too much of a focus on low-level blood alcohol content. But anyway, the organization was founded many years ago. I don't remember how long ago, I'm going to guess 30, 40 years ago. And actively promotes stricter drunk driving laws, does some good things like, they conduct sessions to help kids understand the risks of drunk driving. But ultimately, it's become a lobby group that pushes for stricter and stricter drunk driving laws. At one point, I saw they want to, there's these breathalyzers or these breath testing devices, and I've seen them advocate they want one in every car. It's commonly called an ignition interlock device, and they want one in every car. That you're innocent, you've never done anything wrong, and they want a device in your car that you have to blow in before you can drive. Or they call it an ambient air detector, that if you get in the car and this device detects alcohol in the air, it won't turn on, or it won't let you put it in gear. And they've made serious proposals like that. They've gone way overboard. And Candace Leitner left the group because they'd gone from trying to reduce the drunk driving problem to trying to stop anyone from drinking alcohol. And part of the problem that people aren't aware of is in some places, Mothers Against Drunk Driving makes money from drunk driving cases that people are sentenced to or required to during their case to go into some kind of counseling program or go into some kind of victim impact panel program, and it's run by a MAD or a MAD affiliate. And this group is making $25 a person or $200 a person, depending on what it is. And 1,000 people come through and they're getting money from it. And people aren't aware of that. And they think it's a bunch of little, old, poor mothers who lost their child who are out there, fighting to make the road safer. And the reality is that it's become another special interest group. And it has been for a long time.
Well, and it's very alarming with with this proposal to put all those devices in cars. Obviously, for the reasons that we've outlined earlier about the problems with some of those devices, but also when you consider that if you have those devices in the cars, the price of the cars is probably going to go up. So, in order to keep the prices about the same, they would offset that by probably removing actual safety features or removing other features to help the driver operate the car the way
I think my
they're
biggest
supposed to.
my biggest concern is if you've ever used a computer and seen a hourglass, on a Microsoft machine where all of a sudden there's an hourglass, you have to wait for something, or the spinning ball on a Macintosh computer, or just freezes, or you have to restart your computer, and you're putting that in your car. What guarantee? What's the reliability of this device? How often is it going to say I can't drive the car when I should be able to drive the car? How many false positives will there be? The scientific term is false positives. And there's a huge false positive problem in breath testing. And these devices, how do we know they're working properly? With the so-called breathalyzer, the data master, the intoxilizer, there is source code that the companies have that determine how the machine works. And the companies will not disclose the source code. So defense lawyers who want to examine, they say, hey, there's a problem in this case. I want to examine the source code to see how it might have screwed up. And the companies fight like hell to not release their source code. And so, it's a black box. We have a black box that says you're guilty, and we can't examine the black box. So there's all kinds of problems with it.
Yeah. Are there any locations where they've been successful in getting these proposals to require those devices in cars passed?
No, I don't think that. Plus, the ignition interlock device generally is a common device used for people who've been convicted, and I would say that's pretty widespread. It is pretty widespread that people who are convicted of drunk driving have to have an ignition interlock device. It may vary by state. Some states it's under these circumstances, and some states it's under other circumstances. And they might have to have it for 3 months or a year, or it depends. So it is very common in that sense, and they are not perfect, and they do have problems. But the broader putting them in every car, no, they're not there yet. The technology they're talking about is probably not ready for prime time. It'll probably be 10 years before they'll claim it's ready for prime time. It'll be 50 years before it's actually ready for prime time. But we'll have it in 10.
Yeah, that seems to be how it always works.
Yeah.
But where do you think this is headed? Do you think we're going to see that in 10 years or so? What do you think might change with DUI laws and drunk driving laws in general?
I've heard it described as a ratchet. It never gets looser. So there will be some Sandy Hook type event, some very, very highly publicized drunk driving death, and that'll prompt some more tightening of the DUI laws. But the key point is it never goes back. You'll never see them say, okay, 0.08 was too strict, we should go back to 0.10. Never going to happen. You're never going to see the penalties reduced. Just never going to happen. There's occasional moments where a local prosecutor, including Palm Beach County and Miami-Dade County, where they adopt these programs we call them diversion programs, and you basically go into a program and you get your charge reduced to something less. Still, actually, Orlando, it's even better. But generally speaking, I expect whatever happens. It's hard to predict how it will happen. I don't think anybody saw the aggravated enhanced DUI laws coming until they came, and then once they happen, they spread around the country. So I think you'll see more of that. The one thing that I think probably would make sense is to look at repeat offenders and what we do with repeat offenders, because the funny thing is, a person who gets his first DUI arrest is treated very harshly. A person who gets his fifth DUI arrest is not treated that much more harshly. That's what's really surprising. I had a guy who was arrested. I represented him on his sixth DWI in New York, and I got him no jail time on his sixth DWI. Now, I did some things. There's some things I did to make it happen that way, but I did the right things, not just from his perspective as a defense lawyer, but from a societal perspective. Got him into counseling, got him to move so he lived closer to his work so he wouldn't have to drive to get to work. I did various things and that was all part of the deal that got him no jail time. But I've heard stories of people getting as many as 20 DUI arrests. Well, if somebody can get 20 DUI arrests, then the system isn't working with the repeat offenders. So that's the thing that, if there was any sense to the system, somebody would crack down harder on repeat offenders. People with serious DUI. Because here's my thing. Look, you get arrested once, there's a good chance you're innocent. You get arrested 5 times, there's a good chance in one of those you were guilty, right? At a certain point, the argument's kind of failing. Now, for me, if you haven't hurt anybody, it shouldn't be a crime anyway. But I would think that if there was any intelligence in the decision-making process, and I'm not sure there is, if there's any intelligence in the decision-making process, there would be a greater effort to crack down on repeat offenders and make it more difficult for them to offend again. And that's something that has not been done well.
Right. So what reasonable solutions, and by reasonable I mean things that we might actually see, what reasonable solutions could come and how would they come about?
Right. Well, in my book, I have a whole chapter on better ways of handling the problem. So for me, and you should keep in mind something people aren't aware of, a large portion of our spending on police and prosecution and courts goes to drunk driving cases. It's one of the most common offenses. And not to mention, people arrested for driving with a suspended license is often the result of a drunk driving arrest. So those cases are often part of the DUI system. So we spend a huge amount of money on that. If we took half that money and we built mass transit, which of course is terrifying to so many people that we might have mass transit in this country. I lived in Japan for a year. Japan has fantastic mass transit. The drunk driving death rate is about a tenth of ours. Mass transit is much safer than driving in general anyway. Mass transit has other benefits. So one of the things I would like to see, and I would try to do it in a privately funded way rather than a government-run way, but deploying mass transit would be a far more cost-effective way of saving lives than arresting people for drunk driving. Zoning laws. Here's another great example of this. And I don't remember, where do you live? In the ballpark? What city? Or
I'm in Texas.
Where in Texas?
Houston.
Okay, I went to Rice University, so I know Houston pretty well. Houston is a sprawling city. It's very hard to live in Houston without a car, right?
Right.
Right. And Houston, however, does not have zoning laws as far as I know. There's little or no zoning laws in the city of Houston.
Right, yeah, I believe it's the only major U.S. city that has that distinction.
But a lot of cities and counties and towns or whatever have very extensive zoning laws. And one of the most common things you'll see in the zoning laws is they will not allow bars to be near residential neighborhoods. And you can't have a bar in or near a residential neighborhood. Typically, like where I live, the nearest bar is about 2 miles away. Well, if I wanted to walk to the bar and walk home, that's a lot more difficult if you make the bar further away. If you're in Japan, if you're in Europe, the pub in England is just down the street. If you're in Japan, the snack or the shot bar, as they're called, is just down the street. So you can walk somewhere, drink, and walk home. Here, you pretty much, and there's no train to take you there in the United States. There's no, the cabs are not readily available. We're too spread out. Japan is very densely populated. Europe is much more densely populated. So it's easier for them to have mass transit. It's easier to find a cab to get you somewhere, more cost effective. So but if you deploy mass transit in a meaningful way, you would reduce that. And if you use zoning laws and you say, we're going to create train stations and we're going to build housing and you have an entertainment district and all the bars, like in Japan where I lived, this is in the book, but I lived in Hiroshima, Japan, and there's a section called Nagarakawa. And Nagarakawa, there's about 4,000 bars in 1 square mile. They're stacked 10 stories high. They're all small. There's almost zero parking, and there's mass transit all over the place. So you wouldn't drive to get to Nagarakawa. You would take a train. You might walk. You might ride your bicycle, whatever. There's various ways to get there. But almost no one drives there, parks, and drives home. So there's a huge amount of alcohol going through there, and nobody's driving home. Well, that's a pretty good system. And we could adopt that, and we could say we're going to create a nightlife district, and we're going to put it right next to a train station, and right next to a bus station, and you're going to put all these things there so that, and we're not going to have any parking for it. Think about this. If the greatest example of this is a typical bar, typical place, you want to open a bar, you're required to have adequate parking for the volume of customers you're going to have, right? That's backwards. If you're going to have a bar, the requirement should be you can't have any parking, right? Or you have parking for your employees and no one else. But that's backwards to zoning thinking. So you could change zoning laws in a meaningful way to say we're going to cluster the bars in one area where there's no parking and there's adequate mass transit, and that would dramatically reduce drunk driving. But we don't think that way. We just, we are in this criminal law mindset that any problem needs to be solved with a cop and a gun. And it's not the right way of doing things, and there's much better ways of doing things. So to me, I'm not saying those things are likely to happen, but if we were going to have any common sense in trying to reduce traffic deaths, what I'm proposing would be a lot better, and it would cost less, and it would save a lot more lives.
No, they're great ideas to think about, and imagine that, solving a social problem in a way that doesn't use politics, and that doesn't use law enforcement, just coming up with more reasonable market-based solutions to fix these issues.
Even if you think about like cigarette tax, and you think we want to reduce smoking, so we're going to have a cigarette tax. Well, ask Eric Garner about the cigarette tax. You remember Eric Garner, right?
Yeah, of
I
course,
can't
in
breathe.
Staten Island.
Well, Eric Garner was killed by a cigarette tax, right? Because it was criminal to not pay it. It was criminal to dodge it. That's ultimately why Eric Garner was killed. So if we take a step back from the answer to every problem as a cop with a gun, and there are places where it may be appropriate to have cops with guns. I got friends who are cops; they have guns. There are places where they're valuable, and one of the things I would argue is this intense focus on drugs and DUI takes away from serious criminals not being prosecuted. There are serious criminals. I've seen this in South Florida a lot. I think this is also common in New York City, that people will commit very serious crimes and they don't have the resources to thoroughly investigate the case and prosecute them, and people end up getting off light on serious crimes where the system is set up to make it easy to prosecute people arrested for drunk driving and drug possession. So those cases get prosecuted vigorously because they're easy to prosecute. And it's one of the consequences that people don't like to hear about, don't want to talk about, is, are we neglecting the prosecution of serious criminals because our resources are devoted to these other things that really shouldn't even be crimes? Nobody wants to talk about that. I mean, I find it hard to find anybody who wants to talk about that.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you for joining me today and for being so generous with your time. Now, we've mentioned some of these things over the course of the interview, but what are the best ways to follow your work? And what do you recommend someone read, or what resources do you recommend someone take a look at if they want to learn more about these issues?
Sure. Well, my website, and I write occasional articles, is fairdui.org. I do more on our Facebook page. That's probably where I do most of what I do with Fair DUI, is on the Facebook page, which is just Fair DUI, FAIRDUI. Resources. There's a great book just about criminal justice in general by a guy named Radley Balko, RADLEY BALKO. Radley Balko's book on the increasing militarization of police is kind of an interesting book, just sort of on the general topic. If you want to step outside the mainstream thought that the police are all good guys and the criminals are all bad, anybody they arrest is a bad guy, and therefore we should shoot them all. If you want to get away from that, that's a good book to read. Other resources, that's a tough one. There's a lot, and it really depends on what you're interested in. Anybody who wants to can email me. My email address should be on my website, or they can message the Fair DUI Facebook page. There's so much to look at, and I struggle with that. I would really encourage people to read my book. It's got 50-some reviews on Amazon. It's 4.6 or 4.7 stars. I only planted the first few, so most of them are genuine reviews. It's only like 99 cents on Kindle and under $5 typically on paperback. And it's a good book that sort of goes through a lot of the DUI stuff that you wouldn't have thought about. And the problem with the book is most people don't read it until it's too late. It's a book you really should read before you get arrested. And most people think, this is kind of the thing, most people think that the DUI laws are about someone else. They don't understand that the DUI laws are about them too. And it's only when you've been pulled into the police car and you're being driven to the station that you realize, wait a minute, they're supposed to do this to the bad guys. Why are they doing this to me? And until people recognize that the DUI laws are about all of us, and that's why, it's really important to read a book like this before you get arrested, so that you understand. And like my advice to people is, don't have a single drink if you're going to drive a car. You shouldn't have a single drink, and I follow this. I will almost never have a drink before driving a car. I'm not saying never, but almost never. I don't drink much anyway. But, you should not have if you know, and I'm sorry if I'm going too long, but a really common sense thing that you will hear people say is, if I'm going to be drinking, if I have too much to drink, I'll call a cab. You've ever heard somebody say something like that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So that model is, I'm going to let the drunk me make the decision, right? I'm trusting the drunk me to make the right decision, which is probably not a good way of approaching things. But it's very common to hear that statement. And you'll hear it from the government, and you'll hear it from other sources. So to me, the answer is, if you think you might be drinking, then take a cab there or take Uber there. Don't give the drunk you the opportunity to make the wrong decision. If you have to if you know you're going drinking, you have to plan ahead in a way that you will not have access to your car. And you can't be perfect about it, but you can be a lot better than most people are. So that's like my biggest piece of advice to anyone is, if you think you're going to have any drinks at all, don't have access to your car. take away, the sober you needs to take away the access to the car so the drunk you can't screw up.
All right. Well, that sounds like great advice. And I want to encourage everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/DUI so that if they want to learn more about what we've been discussing today, they will have access to all those resources right there in one place. So we'll link to fairdui.org, and we'll link to your book and Facebook page and Twitter account and everything we've been discussing over the course of this interview. So that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/DUI for the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list while they're on our website so that they can stay up to date with what's going on with the show. And Warren, I know we went way over time, but thank you. This is an important topic and something I don't know very much about. So I apologize for my ignorance in many areas of this discussion, but I'm glad we were able to go through this and you're able to help my listeners get walked through what to do in what situation and how all of this stuff works. So thank you.
Thank you very much. This was fun. I enjoy doing this.
All right, sure. Well, anytime we'll do it again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.